My name is Rachel Bennett, and for 5 years I have carried a secret shame that was never mine to carry. I'm 42 years old. I married my husband Daniel when I was 35, and from the very first Thanksgiving dinner at his mother's house, I understood that I had married into more than a family. I had married into a courtroom, and I was always the one on trial. Linda Bennett sat at the head of that table like a queen surveying her kingdom. She had raised Daniel alone after his father left when he was 9, and she never let anyone forget the sacrifices she'd made. "I gave that boy everything," she used to say, looking at me over her wine glass. Everything. And all I ever asked for in return was grandchildren. For the first 2 years, I laughed it off. Daniel and I were young, relatively, and we were building our life. He worked as a project manager at a logistics company outside Columbus, Ohio. I taught 3rd grade at a public elementary school. We had a small house with a blue door and a guest room we jokingly called the Someday Nursery. By year 3, the jokes stopped. "Still nothing?" Linda would ask every single time we visited, her eyes flicking down to my stomach like she was checking a scoreboard. "You know, Rachel, in my day, a woman knew her body. She knew when something was wrong." I started making excuses not to go to family dinners. Migraines, grading papers, a cold that never quite existed. But avoiding Linda only made things worse because it gave her more time alone with Daniel, more time to plant seeds of doubt in a marriage that, until then, had felt unshakable. "My mom mentioned maybe you should see a specialist," Daniel said one night, not quite meeting my eyes as he set the table. "I have seen a specialist, Daniel. Twice. Everything came back normal." I know. She just worries. She just worries. That was the phrase I heard for 5 years, the shield Daniel held up every time his mother crossed a line. He never told her to stop. He never once, in 5 years, said the words, "Mom, that's enough." By year 4, Linda had stopped being subtle. At my sister-in-law's baby shower, Daniel's cousin Melissa was pregnant with her 3rd child. Linda cornered me by the punch bowl, in front of at least 6 other women. "You know, some women just aren't meant to be mothers," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry. "It's not a failure, Rachel. It's just nature telling you something. Some women are cursed that way. Barren. It happens." I stood there holding a plastic cup of pink punch, my face burning, while 6 women I barely knew suddenly found their shoes very interesting. Melissa, to her credit, tried to change the subject, but the damage was done. By the following week, I heard through Daniel's aunt that the story going around the family was that poor Daniel was stuck with a wife who couldn't give him children, and that Linda had always had a feeling about me. A feeling. As if my body were a warning sign she'd read the day we met. That night, I told Daniel I couldn't keep doing this. I asked him, I begged him to say something to his mother, just once, just to draw a line. "She's just old-fashioned," he said. "She doesn't mean anything by it." "She called me cursed in front of your whole family, Daniel." "I'll talk to her." He didn't. I want to be clear about something. I never once heard Daniel defend me by name. Not once in 5 years did he say, "Mom, stop talking about Rachel like that." He would change the subject. He would laugh nervously. He would, later, in the car, tell me he was sorry I had to hear that. But sorry was never the same as standing beside me when it mattered. I didn't know yet that the ground beneath our marriage was already cracked. I didn't know that the woman calling me cursed was sitting on a secret so devastating that when it finally came out, it wouldn't just humiliate her. It would unmake the entire story she had spent 5 years building about who was to blame. That story started to crumble on an ordinary Tuesday in March in a doctor's office with fluorescent lighting and a box of tissues placed just a little too conveniently on the corner of the desk. Dr. Patricia Warner had been my OBGYN for 6 years. She was the kind of doctor who looked you in the eye instead of at her chart, and that Tuesday, she looked at me for a long moment before she spoke. "Rachel, I want to go over your results from the full fertility panel." I gripped the arms of the chair. Daniel wasn't with me. He'd said work was too busy, though I suspected it was more that he didn't want to sit through another appointment that might, once again, point the finger at nothing. "Your ovarian reserve is excellent for your age. Your hormone levels are within a healthy range. Your uterus and fallopian tubes show no structural abnormalities. Rachel," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "there is nothing in your results that would prevent a pregnancy." I sat there, stunned into silence. 5 years of appointments, 5 years of my mother-in-law's whispered accusations, 5 years of feeling like my own body had betrayed me, and here was a doctor telling me, plainly, that nothing was wrong. "Then why," I finally managed, "have we not been able to conceive?" "That's the question," Dr. Warner said gently. "Infertility isn't always about the woman, Rachel. In nearly half of all cases, male factors play a role, either partially or entirely. Has Daniel ever had a semen analysis?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. In 5 years of trying, of appointments, of tears, of Linda's cruelty, Daniel had never once been tested. Not because anyone had ruled him out, because no one had ever thought to ask. I drove home that day with the paperwork on the passenger seat, my hands tight on the wheel. When I told Daniel that night, his reaction told me everything about the world he'd been raised in. "You want me to go get tested? Like, at a clinic?" "Yes, Daniel. It's a simple test. My mom's never going to let this go if she finds out." There it was. Not concern for our marriage, not curiosity about his own health, fear of his mother's reaction. In that moment, I understood something I hadn't let myself admit before. Daniel wasn't just failing to defend me from Linda. He was more afraid of his mother than he was committed to the truth. "I'm not asking your mother's permission," I said. "I'm asking my husband to take a 15-minute test." It took 3 more weeks of arguing before Daniel finally agreed, and even then, he made me swear not to tell Linda. "Let's just find out first," he said. "No need to worry her." No need to worry her. As if 5 years of her humiliating me hadn't been worth a single moment of worry in return. The test results came back on a Friday afternoon. I remember exactly where I was standing. In my classroom, grading spelling quizzes, when Daniel called. His voice was different, smaller. They said my count is really low, like significantly low. The doctor mentioned something called oligospermia, and there's a note here about a possible blockage related to something when I was a teenager. I sat down slowly at my desk. "What thing? What happened when you were a teenager?" There was a long silence on the line. "I don't know. I need to ask my mom." That single sentence would unravel everything. Daniel called his mother that same night. I sat on the couch, arms crossed, listening to one side of a conversation that started calm and ended in a silence so heavy I could hear my own heartbeat. "Mom, the doctor's asking about my medical history. Something about, did I have mumps as a teenager? Was I ever sick, like really sick, around 13 or 14? I watched Daniel's face change. First confusion, then something closer to disbelief. He pulled the phone away from his ear slightly, as if he needed distance from what he was hearing. "Wait, what do you mean you knew? Mom, what do you mean the doctor told you back then?" I stood up. My whole body had gone cold. Daniel put the phone on speaker, his hand shaking. And there was Linda's voice, filling our living room, trying, even now, to sound reasonable. Daniel, it was one doctor's opinion, decades ago. When you had that terrible fever at 14, the pediatrician mentioned it could possibly affect fertility down the road in rare cases. I didn't want to burden you with something that might not even be true. You were a child. That was almost 25 years ago, Daniel said, his voice cracking. Why didn't you ever mention it? Not when we got engaged? Not once in the last 5 years while Rachel was going through test after test? While you were telling everyone she was... He stopped himself, but I finished the sentence silently in my head. Cursed. Barren. I didn't think it was relevant, Linda said. Rachel had her own issues, clearly, if nothing was happening. I assumed... She doesn't have any issues, Mom. The doctor confirmed it. It's me. It might have always been me. And you knew there was a chance. You knew for 25 years, and you let everyone believe it was Rachel. The silence that followed was the longest of my life. I need you to understand what this meant. Linda hadn't just failed to mention a piece of medical history. She had actively built a 5-year narrative. At Thanksgivings, at baby showers, in whispered phone calls to relatives, blaming me for something she had every reason to suspect might not be my fault at all. She had watched me sit through humiliating conversations, had called me curse to my face, had let an entire family believe I was somehow deficient as a woman, all while sitting on information that could have redirected the entire investigation from the start. Why would she do that? I would learn the fuller answer only a few days later, but the first layer of it came out that night, in Linda's own defensive words, delivered without a hint of shame. A mother doesn't want to think her son might be the reason, she said quietly. I didn't want people looking at Daniel that way. He's my son. It was easier to let things be. Easier. Easier for her to let me absorb 5 years of blame than to risk a single uncomfortable conversation about her son. Easier to sacrifice my dignity, my mental health, my marriage, than to protect me, the woman who had done nothing but love her son and want a family with him. Daniel hung up the phone without saying goodbye. He sat down across from me, his eyes red, and for the first time in 5 years, he said the words I had needed to hear from the very beginning. I am so sorry, Rachel. I should have protected you from this a long time ago. It was a start. But an apology after the damage was already permanent felt like trying to put out a house fire with a teaspoon of water. We didn't confront Linda publicly right away. Daniel wanted time to process, and honestly, so did I. But by the time Thanksgiving rolled around 8 months later, I had made a decision. I would not sit at that table again and let Linda's version of our story stand unchallenged. The extended family gathered as they always did. Aunts, uncles, cousins, the same faces that had watched me get humiliated at that baby shower years before. Melissa was there again, this time with her 3rd child on her hip. Linda, as always, sat at the head of the table, presiding over the meal like nothing had changed. She tried at first to keep the peace. She complimented my green bean casserole. She asked polite, surface-level questions about my school year. I let her. I waited. I wanted the moment to be right, not reactive. It came when Daniel's Aunt Carol, clearly unaware of what had happened, turned to me with a sympathetic smile and asked, "Any news on the baby front, honey? We're all still hoping for you two." The table went quiet, in that particular way tables go quiet when everyone is politely pretending not to be listening. Linda answered before I could. "Some things just aren't meant to be, Carol. I've made my peace with it." That was the moment. I set down my fork. "Actually, Linda, there is news," I said, keeping my voice level and calm. Daniel and I found out that his fertility has been affected since he was a teenager. There was an illness, a fever, mumps, I believe, when he was 14. His doctor mentioned it might affect things down the road. I let that sit in the air for a moment before continuing. What's interesting is that Linda already knew this. She's known for 25 years. She just never told either of us. Not when we got married, not during the 5 years we struggled, not during any of the conversations where she called me cursed or barren or told this entire family that some women just aren't meant to be mothers. You could have heard a pin drop. Aunt Carol's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. Melissa's husband stared into his plate like it might swallow him whole. "That is not," Linda started, her face flushing red. "That's not a fair way to characterize." "Is any part of it untrue?" Daniel interrupted. His voice was steady in a way I had never heard from him before. "Did you know, or did you not know, Mom?" Linda didn't answer. She didn't need to. Her silence was the loudest confirmation possible. "For 5 years," I continued, my voice shaking now but not stopping. "I sat in doctors' offices being tested for everything imaginable. I cried in bathrooms after family parties. I stopped coming to some of these dinners because I couldn't bear being looked at like I was broken. And the entire time, the answer might have been sitting in a decades-old pediatrician's note that you decided wasn't relevant to share." "I was protecting my son," Linda said, her voice smaller now. "You were protecting your pride," Daniel said quietly. "You let the woman I love be humiliated for 5 years so that nobody would ever look at your son and wonder if something was wrong with him. That's not protection, Mom. That's cruelty." Aunt Carol set down her napkin. "Linda, is this true?" Linda didn't answer that either. She excused herself from the table and didn't come back for the rest of the meal. I won't pretend the silence that followed felt like a victory. It didn't. It felt like grief. Grief for 5 wasted years. Grief for a version of my marriage that could have started healing so much sooner. Grief for the parts of myself I'd let Linda convince me were broken. But it also felt, for the first time in half a decade, like the truth. Word travels fast in a family like Daniel's, and within a week everyone knew. Aunt Carol called me personally to apologize for the things she'd said over the years without knowing better. Melissa sent a long, tearful text, admitting she'd always suspected Linda was harder on me than the situation called for, but had never felt like it was her place to say anything. Even Daniel's father, who had been absent for most of his life, reached out. "I always thought your mother held grudges like they were trophies," he told Daniel over the phone, in a rare moment of honesty. "I'm sorry you and Rachel got caught in one." Linda, for her part, did not handle the fallout with grace. She called Daniel, furious that he had embarrassed her in front of the family. She insisted she had done nothing wrong, that she'd only ever wanted grandchildren, that everyone was overreacting to one old doctor's note. It was Daniel, not me, who finally drew the line his mother had needed drawn for 25 years. "You don't get to call what you did an overreaction," he told her. "You let Rachel carry the weight of something that might have been about me for 5 years because you cared more about how it looked than about how it felt for her to live through it. If you want a relationship with either of us going forward, that starts with an apology to Rachel. A real one. Not for embarrassment. For the years." Linda did eventually apologize. I'll be honest with you. It wasn't the apology I'd dreamed about in the darker moments of those 5 years. Even then she couldn't fully own it. But something had shifted permanently. Linda no longer had the moral high ground she'd built her identity around for 5 years. The family no longer looked at me with pity or quiet judgment. They looked at her with something closer to disappointment. And that, in its own way, was its own kind of justice. As for Daniel and me, we started actually addressing the real issue, his fertility, with a specialist who confirmed the earlier illness had indeed caused a partial blockage. It wasn't a hopeless diagnosis. There were options. A minor surgical procedure, followed by monitoring, and if that didn't work, IVF using a sperm retrieval technique the specialist had seen succeed in similar cases. For the first time in 5 years, we weren't just guessing in the dark. We had answers, we had a plan, and we had it together, as partners, instead of me carrying the entire emotional weight alone, while Daniel stood quietly beside his mother's version of events. It's been 14 months since that Thanksgiving dinner. I want to tell you that everything worked out with a storybook ending, and in some ways it did, but not in the way either of us expected going in. Daniel had the procedure. It helped, but not enough on its own. We moved forward with IVF, and after one difficult, heartbreaking failed cycle, our second attempt worked. I am now 5 months pregnant. I think about those 5 years often. The doctor's appointments, the humiliation at that baby shower, the whispered word cursed that used to replay in my mind at 3 a.m. I think about how much of that pain was manufactured, not by my body, but by a woman who chose her own comfort over my dignity, every single time she had the chance to tell the truth. Linda knows about the pregnancy now. She has tried, in her way, to reset the relationship, offering to help decorate the nursery, asking about names, showing up with gifts. I let her back into our lives, cautiously, because Daniel asked me to, and because I believe people can grow, even late, even imperfectly. But I no longer sit silently while she speaks over me. I no longer let her rewrite our story to protect her own image. The biggest change, though, isn't in my relationship with Linda. It's in my marriage with Daniel. For 5 years, he stood beside his mother out of guilt, out of fear, out of a lifetime of conditioning that told him keeping the peace mattered more than protecting his wife. That Thanksgiving broke something in him, but it also built something new. He learned, finally, what it means to choose his marriage first, even when it costs him comfort with his mother. If you're a woman reading this who has ever been made to feel broken by a body that was never actually the problem, by a mother-in-law, a partner's silence, a family that chose easy assumptions over hard questions, I want you to hear this clearly. The story other people tell about your body is not always the true one. Sometimes the truth is sitting quietly in a place no one has bothered to look, protected by someone who cared more about their own comfort than your 5 years of pain. I was never cursed. I was never barren. I was simply a woman married into a family that needed someone to blame, and for 5 years they chose me because it was easier than looking closer to home. They know better now. And soon, God willing, they'll meet the baby that proves once and for all exactly how wrong they were.